First, thank you all for being here. I'm really excited by how many people signed up for this conversation, and I do want to make it a conversation as much as I can. There'll be some presenting, but there'll be time for us to talk together as well. So, like I said, I'm Rebecca. I am today the field CTO at Swarmia, which is a company that builds a platform for engineering effectiveness. I've been there about a year, and before that, I was at Stripe for 2 years working in their developer productivity organization. There, I was lucky enough to lead several projects that were incredibly impactful on the productivity of developers at Stripe. And previous to that, I was at Indeed. I was there for about 5 years working on developer productivity, specifically in the front end space, which is where I came from. Although don't ask me to write any code. Actually, I'm getting into Python lately, but don't ask me to explain the innards of JavaScript. So yeah, today I want to talk about secrets of effective engineering organizations, but really, like, I have gotten to see, and at Swarmia we get to see a lot of organizations who are trying to figure out how to be more effective, especially in this post-ZERP period where money is not cheap anymore and funding is not always so forthcoming as it used to be. How do we be effective with the resources we have is a question that we hear a lot of companies asking. Oh, there we go. So there's about me. These are all the places you can find me, although I'm really not on Twitter very much anymore at all. And I also have a podcast called Unblocked and Engineering Unblocked. And I wrote a book as well that you can grab at swarmia.com/build. And I'll talk about that more at the end. So I really like to, come on, go to the next slide. There we go. One thing that I feel very passionately about is that you can't talk about developer productivity, developer experience, or business outcomes without talking about the other two. They're all really deeply entwined when it comes to, using an engineering organization to deliver value for the business, because that's what an engineering organization is typically for, right? We don't hire them to write code. We don't hire them to deliver value. So engineering effectiveness exists at the intersection of these three things. Business outcomes. So did the work that we did matter? Was it the right work? Did we spend the right amount of time on it, etc.? Developer productivity really gets into like the nuts and bolts of delivering software. So how long does it take to release? How often can you release? How easy is it to roll back? These sorts of things. And then developer experience is this. It sounds squishy, but I really believe it's not. Developer experience is how hard is it to do the thing you're trying to do? And is it harder than the thing should be to do it? So, imagine you're adding a button to the homepage. That should be really, really easy. That shouldn't require you to understand, for example, your entire deployment stack. Or to babysit a deployment to get that button out into production. You should be able to focus on the unique work that you're trying to do, and not be distracted by things that are really tangential or completely orthogonal to the work that you're doing or the work that you're trying to do. I talk about developer experience often in terms of how long did I have to wait for something. Maybe I had to wait for a human. Maybe I had to wait to find the documentation I needed. Maybe I had to wait for security to say that what I wanted to do was okay. But really, I focus developer experience a lot on this idea of waiting on humans, waiting on machines. So my boss, Otto, likes to say something along these lines, that to improve effectiveness, you just need to reliably learn about and then systematically eliminate everything that diminishes effectiveness, right? Like, that is, in fact, what you need to do. And so that means you need to identify what are the things that are diminishing effectiveness and then prioritize them and then work on them and burn them down. So here, this next little bit is this is not the part where you need to answer things in chat. You don't need to you don't need to share your scores. But just to get the conversation started, I wanted to run through a little assessment. And this assessment is based on the idea that there are some key ingredients required to be able to do that identification and mitigation of issues that are affecting effectiveness. So first, you're going to do this on paper or whatever makes you comfortable. You can do it in your head. I think that would be hard. But we're going to go through about a dozen questions, maybe a little bit more. And for each question, do it quick, rate your org on a scale of 1 to 5. 5 is the best. At the end, we're going to keep the math simple and just add up all the points that you gave yourself. So this is trying to kind of baseline, where are you today? And like I said, you don't need to share this, but we'll talk about it in a little bit after we go through the questions. So pencil, paper, or method of your choice. Everyone has a computer, so you can always do that. All right. So the first thing that we talk about as being kind of table stakes for an effective organization is empowered teams. So I'm not going to read these questions to you because I'm pretty sure you can read them, but just run through these 4 questions and real quick, give yourself a score, 1 to 5. All right. I am going to move on to the next slide unless people wave their hands at me. Okay, none of the people I can see are waving their hands at me. So next, limited backlog. This is really just based on plain old math, Q math in particular. The more tasks you have on your backlog, the longer it's going to take for you to process your backlog, and the harder it's going to be to prioritize your backlog. So just a couple questions on that. And next, kind of related to the limited backlog, is limited work in progress. Again, Q math, or queuing theory, I guess is what I should call it, not Q math. But Q math tells us that the more things you have in progress, the longer it will take for those things to get done. If you're working on just one thing from start to finish, then it is more likely to get done faster than if you're working on 3 things that you're trying to work on start to finish. Right. Next, rapid feedback. People don't have to wait a long time to find out whether the work they did was good and right and correct. So the simplest kind of feedback is pull request feedback, right? Like approving or commenting on a pull request. But there's also cases where you need to, say, present something to leadership, and you don't want to put your teams in a place where they are gathering up months of work to present to you for your approval, because they might have done it all wrong or not have understood what you're asking for. So keeping those feedback loops short and making sure that there are scheduled opportunities to get feedback so that feedback isn't meaningfully blocking the work. Next is small tasks. Again, if a task is small, then it can be completed quickly. And if a task is large, then it can be completed quickly. So it is, even if you have to break down something that you might have normally taken a week to complete, if you break that down to 5 tasks that take 1 day, well, number one, you can parallelize that. You can have another person work on that same work because you've broken it down into smaller bits. And number 2, again, small tasks get done faster and introduce fewer quality issues with the code that you're putting into the world. They also make it really easy to recognize, what was the cause of a quality issue. If you're shipping small things and shipping them rapidly, then it becomes really easy to kind of recognize quickly when you've introduced a quality problem into your product. And then finally, outcomes over outputs. This is a lot of the traditional thinking in the developer productivity space. Well, don't even want to say traditional thinking. A lot of the kind of default thinking, the naive thinking, is engineers are here to produce code, and the more code engineers produce, the more value we're getting out of those engineers. But again, we don't know, like, was it the right code? Did it accomplish the business outcome that it was supposed to? And those sorts of questions, we don't ask them if we're focused on outputs. We just say, wow, you did a lot of pull requests this week, good job. But we have to inspect whether that work, whether all those pull requests had the result that they were supposed to have. Otherwise, we just wrote a lot of code with little value. And then a bonus question, which maybe was more relevant in, say, 2020, but I hear people are still hiring today too. So last question is, I'm satisfied with our ability to attract and retain engineering talent. All right. I'll give you a minute to do math. Maybe you should have used a spreadsheet. I don't know. I'll give you a minute to do math. And then I would love to hear from the group, kind of, is there anything that occurred to you in doing this exercise, or any areas that you've identified are maybe especially in need of attention? Oh yes, and you can answer this in chat, or you can answer it on video. That's cool too. I will call on people. Any place that you had to write down a 2 and it felt bad? No? Who has all 5s across the board? What are you doing here?
Just to make sure everyone knows, even if it's recorded, you speak, we'll cut it out or anonymize it. So I don't want to have it recorded to hold it back.
Yeah.
But
I had all 3s and 4s, so.
Okay. So I feel like you're doing okay.
Okay. Yeah, I think so.
Is there anything that you don't feel okay about that didn't get touched on there?
No. I mean, I'm in a lucky position that the team is pretty small, so I guess that helped a lot, right? When remembering when I had like 6 CFTS, it was a totally different story.
Thomas, you can go ahead.
Yeah, so I'm talking on behalf of my previous job, where I stopped a few months ago, but it was really hard for us to get the outcome versus output thing in place. You know, we had a big product with 80 engineers and 300 people in the organization altogether, but building one product and getting the empowered teams to focus on outcome and really understand the impact they have just turned out to be so much harder than than we had anticipated. And I read your book, by the way, and it's awesome. It's like, it just everything, Martin Kagan says, and we know this group have been talking a lot about that. It's just spot on, but oh my, it's hard.
Oh my, it's hard. Yes. As we were working on the book, there were a lot of times where I was like, this is really idealistic. Is that okay? But I think that was the goal of it, is to kind of spell out, like, this is what good could look like. I'm curious with the outcomes over outputs. So was it the engineering teams that were kind of resisting that?
So we had a product where we didn't have a true north. We didn't know what good looked like. We one place where we did not succeed, and your book doesn't cover that part either, but we were a sales-led organization, salespeople going out and and big organizations, 6 to 12 months cycle times, and we didn't know if what we shipped yesterday, even though we shipped 30 times per day, we didn't know if it made an impact, and we didn't know if that caused our users to be happy, or if that helped with churn, and let alone then giving the teams outcomes that they really believed in and understood how they could impact. That was really hard.
Got it. So more of a business-wide challenge, not pushback from the engineers.
Also pushback from engineers because they didn't understand it. So they just tell us what to do and we'll do it.
Got it. Who else? Let's have one more person kind of reflect on this. Oh, did somebody just?
Yes.
Rebecca, I'm wondering about the importance of the limited backlog feature that you were speaking about. Because I think that, at least from my perspective, it doesn't matter as much as long as new tasks are prioritized according to their importance.
And actually, it can be very beneficial for the teams to understand what the mid long-term vision for them is. And one way to achieve that is to agree on what work should be done at some point, and that's part of the backlog.
And actually, it can be very beneficial for the teams to understand what the mean long-term vision for them is. And one way to achieve that is to agree on what work should be done at some point. And that's part of the backlog.
Yeah, I totally hear that. And I think that the goal of limited, so there are different backlogs, at least in any organization I've worked in, there are different backlogs. There's the product, organization's vision for the future, and hopefully engineering is bought into that vision for the future as well. So there's that kind of backlog. Here I'm talking very much about the backlog of what do I work on next? What is ready for me to work on next? So I think that readiness is a key distinction. So yeah, keep a list of lots of things, but I mean, 2013, I worked at, we had 500 things in our backlog. You never knew when the top 10 were prioritized, but the rest might as well not have been there because you never knew when they were going to get done. And in some cases, people have put a lot of work into writing those tickets that would never, ever see the light of day. So it's more about like, don't get yourself overly ready. Don't get a task ready if you are not, you're not going to be able to do it for 6 more months. Like focus, because 6 months from now, that task could be irrelevant, or 1 month from now, you might decide that it's suddenly urgent. So I think of it in terms of that readiness. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Perfect. Fully aligned.
Cool. All right. Feel free to reflect more later or ask questions later, but I'm going to just move on to re-emphasize what we just said. And it's so funny to me because like in some cases, literally, we have math to tell us that this is the way to do things, especially on the limited backlog, limited work in progress, and rapid feedback, and small tasks, indeed. There's math that demonstrates that a queue behaves a certain way, and we can apply that to our teams and our organizations. Not so much on the outcomes over outputs. Thomas, you have a very good point that one's really hard and is more of a cultural change. But these are the things that we see, we know, and Marty Kagan knows, and Reinertsen knows, and the guy whose last name is very long knows that these are key ingredients into a effective organization. An effective engineering organization is what we're talking about here, but in any organization where you are ultimately processing tasks. I hate to reduce it to that because I understand that engineering is so much more than that. But ultimately, and especially to sufficient size, we can think of this as like our backlog behaves as a queue. Our engineers work the queue, service the queue. And by realizing those two things, we can realize these are they're hard to debate because they're backed up by math. So in the next section, I want to talk about leading change. And I'm not prepared to say specific stuff about business outcomes, but I'm going to try and come back to that for you, Thomas. So leading change, this is something that I was really a big part of at Indeed, and going through the process of, we know nothing about how effective our engineering organization is, to being able to put some numbers around it, put some understanding around it, push understanding upwards, and then working on proving it. So yeah, let's go through it. I have this, it was late at night and I needed an acronym. So came up with BRAINS for this acronym for promoting and establishing engineering effectiveness. So benchmark, research, act, invest, normalize, and sustain. So benchmarking, we kind of just did a little bit of it just with the assessment alone, right? Like you can look at the numbers that you wrote down and say, ooh, I'm not so happy about that too. Or maybe you're like, I could have had no twos and you're very lucky. But the first thing that you need to do is just understand where you are period. And this can be anything from doing team health checks. So Atlassian has a really great team health check where you break your team into 2 parts, ask them to rate the team on a set of questions, and then bring the team back together as one to talk about where there are areas of disagreement. That's a really great exercise that I love. It doesn't take a ton of time. It's easy to repeat. That kind of covers I don't want to say that covers the developer experience part, but it gets into all 3 business outcomes: developer experience and developer productivity. Obviously, like, humans talking is great, and you'll get actually a lot of insight out of talking to humans rather than trying to put numbers on everything. But at the very early stage, there are absolutely things that you can put numbers on. So how often are you releasing? How often are you shipping defects? How long does it take you to recover from shipping a defect? How long does it take from something to go from in progress on the board to done? These are all things that you can measure relatively easily, and P.S. Swarmia does a lot of it for you if you want. But these are all things that you can do relatively easily. I've seen it done at a variety of places in a variety of ways. Especially if you're just getting started, though, if you're working on something relatively new, you will love yourself forever if you put in the effort upfront to instrument the kind of SDLC of getting work done at your organization. So it can be harder to add that in later. And if you add it in early, and indeed, I have heard this story where new VP of engineering shows up. Indeed is still only about 100 people. And Indeed is a job search company. So Indeed is only about 100 people, 100 engineers. New VPE shows up and says, we're using Jira. And 100 engineers grumble a lot. And much argument, much engineers being engineers, and the VP stuck with it. He was like, "No, we're using Jira, and we'll be glad later, I promise." And in 10 years after he showed up, the amount of information we had about how we shipped software and what we shipped and who shipped it and how long it took, it was all sitting there in Jira for us to just suck out, and so we could actually establish a really good benchmark for where are we today, and then start to work on making that better. Research is, I think, really undervalued in this. So one of the projects that I did at Stripe was I set up an engineering effectiveness team, and we needed to figure out, like, okay, what should we go do? We had a lot of numbers that we could work on improving, like all the numbers you wanted, we had those. But we decided we also wanted to go talk to people and hear what people were struggling with. And what we saw when we sat and watched people work, when we tried to work in their systems, when we just interviewed them about what's hard, all sorts of things came up or didn't come up. Sometimes you would see somebody, you would see that, like, in a 5-minute period, they had to click this one button like 20 times. And they should have been annoyed about it, but to them, they're just like, well, that's how I do it, is I click the button 20 times. And we're saying you shouldn't be like, that is really inefficient. You're clicking the button, waiting, clicking the button, waiting, clicking the button, waiting. And it turned out that we could actually reel all of that in and have the team that owned the button make it a button that you had to click a lot less often. So it was no longer like a step that people had to take in their workflow. We didn't have any metric to tell us about that, but it was actually an incredibly simple fix. And it's a fix that we wouldn't have learned about if we hadn't gone out and talked to humans. So I think this, having honest conversations with your engineers about what's hard for you, what's getting in your way today, like how could this ticket that you're working on be easier? Those sorts of questions can really surface a lot of opportunity that sometimes isn't even technical. Sometimes it could just be a process change, or sometimes it could just be a misunderstanding of how you do work at this company. And getting close to your engineers at Stripe as well, the CTO every half or so would pick up a ticket. And this was in an organization of about 2,000 engineers. He would pick up a ticket, he would go sit with the team, metaphorically, and work on it, and then write a friction log about what he experienced in doing that. And I thought it was a really cool thing, because he wasn't afraid to get close to work. Now, 2,000 engineers, the CTO shouldn't be writing much code probably ever. But it was such a valuable experience for him to see like what it was like to actually do the work in his organization. Oh, this is supposed to say ACT, but it says address. We changed the acronym at Subway. So the next thing is like do something about it. And it doesn't have to be like we're going to go from releasing once a week to once a day over the next 6 weeks. It can be small things too that just create this sense of like, this is something that we care about. This is something that we're willing to invest time in. This is something that we care about. And this is something that's okay to care about. It's okay to talk about. So going back to that button, we never would have learned about it from the metrics, but we learned about it from the humans. And we were able to get that information to the team that owned the button, and they were able to fix it quickly. And so that was a great, this was something that impacted everyone working in Java, I think, basically. This is a thing that impacted everyone working in Java at Stripe. And it was, again, just a gesture of goodwill that we hear you, we're fixing things, we want to hear more things like this. So again, low latency feedback loops so that when issues come up, you can address them quickly, or at least choose whether to address them quickly. Another thing we did at Stripe was to make it really easy for people to complain about things. So we call it the bad day button. And we put this bad day button through a Chrome extension all like on any site that somebody might interact with during their workday. And so you could click the button and say, I just ran into this problem and I'm mad, right? We got, again, so much intelligence out of that we would never ever see in pure metrics. And again, we were able to discover these things that we could actually really quickly resolve as soon as we knew about them. One team, the team that owned the LDAP system, they had their metrics for success were very operational. I can't recall exactly what they were, but it was kind of like, time to request approval. So if you asked for permission to join an LDAP group, that request they were responsible for routing that request and getting the request actioned in a timely manner. And that was their kind of North Star metric. What it turned out, though, was that the teams, like the people actually using the LDAP group system, their individual approvals were getting done really fast. That wasn't the problem. The problem was that certain decisions had been made at certain times that meant that you had to request sometimes a dozen groups to do something that was incredibly simple. And you would have to wait for each of those dozen approvals to come back. And so individual approvals were coming back quickly, but you needed them all done at once before you could move forward. So again, use the wisdom of your engineers to see where there are opportunities to make small improvements that set the tone that we care about this. We care about this, and we are investing in doing something about it. And you might even want to go so far as to say, and it's okay for you to, like, if you see a productivity improvement you could make in your day-to-day job, like, it's okay. Like, do it, because that's going to pay off for years if you spend the 2 hours, 5 hours today making the change. If you can take your deploys from 10 minutes to 5 minutes by doing 5 hours of work, do it, because just eliminating that waiting time between kind of micro tasks while you're trying to complete a task is so powerful as far as letting engineers get into and stay in flow. So invest is next. And that's when you start thinking beyond the low-hanging fruit. It's not about, oh, there's this bug, or, oh, there's this thing that could be a little bit better. It's starting to really own the development process as a product. And like, spoiler, your development process already is a product, just probably nobody owns it. And probably no one designed it like a product. And probably nobody thought about how all the pieces work together. And certainly no one's responsible for thinking about how all those pieces go together, let alone a team. And so this is when it starts to be like, we're going to actually invest in, this is important to us. We're going to invest in it visibly and start to look at what are some bigger levers that we could pull. Indeed, I worked on, I was the manager. Engineers worked on a system to micro front-end So like microservices for front end. So rather than an HTML page being generated from a single service, it would actually reach out to multiple services, and then all the pieces would get stitched together. So you could kind of have modules on the page that could be deployed independently rather than having to deploy the whole page all at once. We started this project because when we started measuring and benchmarking, we found out that the job search front-end code base, it was predictably more than 20 business days from starting a task to it being in production. They had manual deploys, they had a very manual QA process, and anyone who wanted to contribute to the job search front-end product, which was everyone, because Indeed.com, the homepage, was in that project. Anyone who wanted to contribute to that project was signing up for a 22-day release process. Like you knew that you weren't going to get out anytime soon. You might get kicked out of a release, etc. So what this micro front end service did is basically let people who wanted to contribute to that page do it out of band from the work that the job search front end team was doing, do it out of band from the deployments that the job search front end team was doing. So these are the kinds of things where once you put a focused effort around the problem, you can start to get step change improvement. So with that micro front end system, people who had normally been waiting 22 days could literally release, like they could start their work and release it inside of 15 minutes if it really was that small of a change, right? So we took away all the complexity of the process, all the complexity around the process, and going back to what I said at the beginning, just boiled it down to you should only have to worry about what you're actually working on, like what you're actually trying to achieve. You shouldn't have to worry about the release process for this other team. You shouldn't have to worry about like who you need approvals from on another team. You shouldn't have to worry about, another team kicking you out of there. Like none of that. That then is not an empowered team. But that's just an example of starting to look at where are our bottlenecks systematically, and spending time not thinking about how can we make that go away tomorrow, but how could we make that better next month? And how can we make it better the month after that, better the month after that? So often this is solved with a platform team, and that is the team that ends up being the one that owns the developer experience. Oh, I'm not the developer experience, the team that owns the development process and whether it's good or not. And that becomes their kind of mission, is that thing where the work is only exactly as hard as it needs to be. And I think that's a great kind of mission for a platform organization, is to just take away all of the complexity, take away all the waiting time, figure out how to take it away. So if I want to make a button, all I have to do is write like 3 lines of HTML or React or whatever. Next is to normalize, which this is how we got to brains, because I showed this to a former colleague at Stripe, and we were brainstorming about it. And she made the point that normalizing this stuff is actually also really important. So when we built the micro front end thingy, it was a product. Like we had to think about it as a product. We had to release it, and we had to educate people about it, and we had to market it, and all these things. But we made it really normal for people to use this new system, and we made it not like they could choose to do something differently, but we made it so obvious that they would buy into the system that they bought into the system. So driving adoption of a standard way to do things, you don't want to do this when you have 10 engineers, probably. Like they all have their own local development environment, and it's very precious to them. But there comes a time, probably right around 50 to 100 engineers, where actually you start to get incredible leverage out of focusing not at the team level, but at the kind of organization level, and really owning that development process as a product. And then finally, unless you are not writing code, this work never stops. So even if your organization isn't growing, your code base is growing. So if you're writing code, this work is never done. It just gets harder. At Stripe, we found ourselves in a situation where our 16 million line monorepo could in some cases take more than 2 minutes to git pull. And that's a problem that you only have when you have 16 million lines of code in a monorepo. But someday you might have 16 million lines of code in a monorepo, and then it truly is just an ongoing effort to keep the systems that worked 2 years ago still working in the current environment. And so your work is never done. It really just gets, I think, more interesting. So again, setting goals on the mission, that mission of the development process is a product, and it should be an easy product to use. Don't set goals on in a quarterly sense, sure, you can set goals around we're going to get build times down by 2 minutes, but your big picture goals should be focused on the mission of nothing should be harder than it needs to be for a developer trying to ship value for the organization. The last thing I'll say is that there's so much that's so hard to give advice about without knowing your exact situation. The size of the organization radically changes the problems that you're likely to have. When you're going from 10 to 50 engineers, maybe that's the time to create that standard local development environment. But you didn't have that problem when you had 10 engineers. That was probably not a good thing to spend time on. So the ways that effectiveness doesn't happen, they really vary over the course of over different sizes of company. Age, of course, has a lot to do with size, or again, at least it used to. But age is also going to be really, really informative here. So some of the challenges that we had at Indeed and even Stripe and Starvoice before that and everywhere before that was that systems were built at a time and they were a reasonable thing to do. It was maybe there wasn't off the shelf. Indeed was a great example of this, where they had to build all sorts of stuff that you just go buy now and don't think twice about it. It didn't exist in 2004 when they were getting started. And so they had to build a lot of things that 10 years later, 20 years later, some of those decisions still exist and make it harder to adopt kind of off the shelf software. You may have to build more of your own stuff depending on how old you are. Indeed had its own like basically the equivalent of BigQuery, not literally like BigQuery, but they had a homegrown querying language and a homegrown pipeline for getting data into the system. And again, it was hard to roll that back, or it took a lot of effort to kind of overcome some of those age-induced challenges. And then finally, like this is the hard answer about stuff like outcomes over outputs, is that some cultures aren't that it's going to be really hard for them to get there. A command and control culture, a really sales-led culture, it's going to actually be hard to do it. And because you're fighting against human nature, this human understanding of, well, this is how a business is run, is you sell things and then people say they want to buy them and then we build them. That was my life at Bizarre Voice. So I think in those cases, it becomes, I would love to talk to you more specifically about those cases, because I don't think there's like a one size fits all, like, oh, here's how you get people to believe in outcomes over outputs. But in general, a lot of when I think about how to kind of convey this to others in the organization, I try as hard as I can to turn it into money every single time, right? Like money is maybe this is a uniquely like particularly American thing, I don't know, but money is the common language that leadership speaks. And so trying to show like when we did when sales sold that thing and then we had to build it in 2 weeks, here are the things that happened that were bad, and this is how much those things cost us. Like we damaged the morale of the team. We've increased our risk of attrition. Attrition is a we could put a number on attrition and how much that matters to financially to the business. We can put money on, well, we shipped it, but then we had 3 weeks of fighting fires for the defects, and that only delayed the other thing that you wanted. Time is a zero-sum game. So yeah, in the general sense, I try to turn this into numbers so that the organization can make a realistic decision about, do we want to keep doing this behavior that is costing us this much money? I was supposed to stop 7 minutes ago was my plan, but we have questions. So let me just pull up this to look at while we talk. You can find me or you can find the book. But yeah, we've got a bunch of questions. So there's some in Q&A and there's some in chat. Let's move questions over to Q&A, but I'll address the one in chat first. So
I moved the ones in I moved the ones in chat over to Q&A already.
Oh, okay,
Streamline
great.
things.
Great. You're on top of it. Sorry. There it is. Okay. What do you think about cumulative flow diagrams as a way to look backwards at how effective our tactics have been? I mean, I think it's great because, like, especially on the limited backlog, you can see, are you getting more done than you're throwing on the pile? So I have used them frequently just to see, like, how is work moving through the team? Where is new work coming from? And how quickly are we burning down the work? I say burning down, that might be a Scrum word. So I think that this works in Scrum Agile land, this works in Kanban land, this works in all the places. In my particular preference is a Kanban world where our tickets are relatively small. There are relatively few of them on the backlog, and we have high confidence, say like 80% confidence, that from the time that this goes to in progress to the time that it's done will be less than 3 days or 60, whatever, some number. So, and I think cumulative flow diagrams help you see, like, how's that going and how's that going to work out over the course of multiple weeks. The emerging perspective, what do I think about the emerging perspective that there's almost no point in looking at developer productivity, that we should only look at developer experience? I get it. And I think that developer experience is actually incredibly overlooked in this space. We were talking to a potential customer the other day and explaining, like, the business outcomes and the developer productivity and the developer experience. And they're like, yeah, we don't want to worry about the developer experience part. We just want those first two. As I know, these things really travel together, I think. So I look at developer productivity as, again, first and foremost, do not use any productivity numbers around individuals. Like, don't. Stop. Don't do it. The unit of action here is the team. And it's not an individual, like, no individual should be able to destroy a team's productivity. And if they are, well, that's an issue that needs to be dealt with. But we really, really encourage that you're never looking at these numbers on an individual level. You're never looking at any numbers on an individual level, because I think that's a lot about what freaks people out about developer productivity as a term. And it's like, you're counting how many widgets are coming off the end of the line. And yeah, if you're counting how many widgets are coming off the end of the line, then there is no point in looking at developer productivity. I agree. But I think that looking at, just in a continuous improvement sense, just looking at how are things getting better. Now, you can learn that from developers, yes, and that probably works just fine in a smaller company. You probably don't need to do a whole lot more. But I think in a larger company where you really are trying to have business level impact on how effective your organization is, you've got to have numbers too. You've got to have numbers, and you've got to be able to set goals. I really like so at Stripe, we had a couple of numbers. We had time waiting on machines, and that was a great one. That was kind of in the developer experience space without us having to go out and talk to all the developers. And then we also, one I liked much less, we looked at PRs per dev per day. That's not a horrible metric. It's a horrible metric if you're looking at it every week. It is not useful at that scale, but it is a useful metric perhaps to just see, like, if we do all those table stakes things, we would expect that pull requests per dev per week to go up, or we would at least expect it not to go down. Like one of those two. If it's going down, something's wrong. If we've made all these changes and now we're getting fewer pull requests, that's weird. So that is a case where I think it's totally fine to measure productivity, but you're measuring it at the organizational level. You're measuring it at the not at the individual level, and it shows up on your report card at the end of the year, but just in a sense of like, are we actually improving the thing that we're setting out to improve? If we were improving that, what would we observe? And so that's kind of how I think about the developer productivity piece is, if I am improving things for the business through the work that I am doing on this very expensive platform team, then I would expect to see this metric go up and to the right, or this metric go down to the right. So it's really a metric for you, especially in a platform sense, but also in a CTO sense. It's a metric for you to know if the work that you're doing is mattering, not a metric to go beat teams up about. Let's see. We have measuring developer experience any other way than surveys is probably suboptimal. Here I really disagree. Surveys are great. You should do them. Surveys have lots of problems too. You have to have a high response rate, like basically 100%, because you're dealing with such a small sample size. You really want to have a high response rate. You also have to recognize that a survey is a moment in time, and maybe somebody had a fight with their partner this morning, or traffic was bad on the way to work. A survey just tells you, like, in that moment when they answered the question, how did they feel about that question? Full of recency bias as well. If things got way better 6 months ago and your survey is annual, then nobody's going to talk about how much better things are, about how much better things got 6 months ago. They're going to be very focused on really the last days and weeks. There's lots more I can say about surveys. I do think surveys are great, and they're coming to Swarmia soon. So I'm not anti-surveys because we're building them. But sorry, I'm looking at all these questions. I do think that there are ways to observe experience that are equally valuable, at least. And one of them is that time waiting on machines. So we created a simple service that if you built a tool for engineers to use, you would use this service to send telemetry about the usage of the tool. Did it error and how long did it take and all these things. So it's really easy to instrument your developer tool. It was really easy to instrument whatever developer tool you were building. And then we, the productivity team, took that and looked at, who was waiting, which tools were causing the longest waits, which tools were causing the longest errors. Were there teams where, like, wow, your wait time on this tool is 6 times the normal? Like, what's that about? So that was a really, really valuable insight that we got from a pretty simple metric, just how long are people spending waiting on machines. I wanted to figure out somehow how to measure time waiting on humans, but I haven't figured that one out yet. But I think that is different from surveys. And then I'll come back to the bad day button. Bad day button is arguably just another survey, I guess, but it was in the moment. In the moment you could say something rather than waiting for a survey to come to you. So again, I would think about, like, if experience was good, what would be observable in our system if the experience was good? Observable in our system would be that, like, you would expect low variability in the time to deliver a task. You would expect that pull requests are at least hanging out, not falling down, pull requests per dev, and probably other things too that you can imagine you could observe. So I really encourage that exercise of, if things were better, how would I know? And then work backwards from there to, okay, how do I get that number? So definitely think surveys have their place, and I think there's a lot more to measuring developer experience than that. And a survey is only as good as the survey. If it was well designed, it'll be great. If it was not well designed, it could be terrible. It could give you really conflicting information, or information that is hard to like hard to detect the real meaning of what somebody was saying, especially in free text. One of your questions was if the team aligns their objectives with the overall business goals. We suck at it. It feels as we have a bunch of ticket monkeys that work on acceptance criteria. How can we make the team better understand and align with business and product strategy goals? Again, culture, this stuff is hard, but one of the things that I think is really valuable is to make sure that engineering, maybe not the whole team, but that make sure that engineering has a seat at the table early in the process. It's not a seat to debate, like, is this a good idea or not? But it's a seat to hear what's happening, hear how product is thinking, hear how sales is thinking, hear how marketing is thinking. I think that getting to a point where that is the team is not the engineers, the team is the people making the decisions about what will be built and the people building it. That, again, can be a really hard culture shift. So I don't want to say that's easy, but that's one of the tactics that I've seen work well. Another one could be like when you're planning stories, to like ask the engineer to articulate why we're doing this, what will be better when it's done, and then how are you going to measure that? How are you going to validate that? That was one thing I discovered, was that I was talking to apparently a ticket monkey who was like, well, I have no idea what value I created by doing my work, and why would I ask product or whatever? And it was just so like, somebody who thinks that the outcomes are somebody else's job has to recognize that like outcomes are everyone's job, and we all have a part to play in it, and we can, it's okay to ask questions about why are we doing this, and it's okay to expect an answer about why are we doing this, and it's okay to calibrate your effort relative to that answer. And it's not just okay, but essential that you are gathering. Sorry, I just lost my train of thought because a message just showed up on my screen. It's essential that you're gathering data about whether that outcome was achieved. So thinking about again, what is the thing that we think will be better when this thing is done? Articulating that, and then putting the instrumentation in place to validate the outcome. Yes, it is time.
Yeah, thank you. And we have one more question, but I guess we can try to answer that on Slack. I'll post it on Slack, and Rebecca can answer there, unless you want to stay on. I don't know. It's up to you. What do you think, Rebecca?
I'm happy to stay on for a minute. I have another thing in half an hour, so I need to prep for that.
So just wrap up, and whoever wants to go can go. Other people can stay for the 2 more questions we have as welcome to. So thank you so much, Rebecca, for sharing this with us. It was so insightful. You really drew from so much years of experience in this space. It was very, very hands-on, practical, and I'm very happy that everyone was able to make it and was there to get it. I did send out a survey, so everyone can fill it out. And thank you, Rebecca, and thank you, Swarmia, for also enabling this community to continue on year-round with continuous events and programming for everyone.
Yeah, absolutely. This was fun. And Thomas, if you can stay, I'm happy to answer your question, or we can head to Slack, whichever works for you.
I would love to hear your take on space, because a lot of people write about it, and you did so, and it's just like so vague that it's, I mean, Dora, I know how to act on it. It's like, okay, we can divide what is, what is a commit and when is on production, but space seems like Nicole Cosgren just needed to have a new thing out there. And
there's probably some of that going on, that, new hot framework. But what I found space useful for is, and this was a big mistake that we made at Stripe, we tried to use it as a reporting tool. Like, how are we doing on productivity? We came up with all these different metrics and all the different categories, and it was too much. It was too much. Like, there was no signal relative to all the noise. The way I think about space when I reflect on that experience is that it's calling it a framework is like a little much. Like, it's a skeleton. And it's a skeleton that kind of tells you, like, okay, so there's the head, there's the hands, there's the feet, there's the body. You need to like think about all of them when you're taking care of this skeleton. So I think of it more as a brainstorming tool for looking at I want to improve effectiveness. In which of these areas do I have levers that I could use? Or how could I create levers in this space? So satisfaction is a great example. Unless you are friends with finance, like you don't own how often people are getting a raise. So that's something that you, depending on where you are in the organization, that's something where you may struggle to get satisfaction because of something that's out of your control. So I think what I like about space is that it reminds you that it's not about that activity is just one part. And that I think is a useful tool for messaging upwards, that like, here's this paper that somebody wrote that explains like activity is one of the things we need to care about. We need to care about these other 4 things as well. So there's some social proof aspect to it of like, there's paper that says that these areas matter just as much as activity does. So it's useful for communicating it up, and it's useful for thinking of like, how are we doing on efficiency and flow? Like, are we good? Are we hearing a lot of complaints about that? That kind of
If I
thing.
may, I mean, I don't disagree with space. When I read it, all makes sense.
Right.
It's the same when I read Martin Fowler and Marty Kagan and so on, it all makes sense. And then McKinsey comes around and tried to make it very concrete, and then everyone, no, don't do that. So the dollar metrics for me are the only metrics that we as an industry kind of like, yeah, okay, if we do more frequent releases and smaller, that's good. And statistics shows, and we as craftsmen also like that. I just wanted to hear if you had any success stories with space, because it's like
I have exactly the opposite. So at least as far as trying to turn space into metrics that we can action, I've kind of stopped thinking about it that way and started thinking about more as like a communication.
For me, it's like
tool.
OKRs. Oh, they're great, and I talked about. But yes,
yeah,
I agree. I wholeheartedly agree. But then I can't.
Yeah, don't get me started about OKRs. Lots of thoughts about that, but yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot going on in this space that is just people trying to name things that have worked for them. And I think going back to that size, age, and culture thing, how if you're using space, whatever that means, how you use it at a 10 engineer company is different from 100, is different from 1,000. I do think at Stripe it was really useful to communicate via a third party that these other things matter, stop caring about activity so much, and having a PhD write that for me, right? Like that was useful. And I do think it's also useful in that brainstorming of like, what are opportunities we have to find improvement? Yeah, don't make a spreadsheet. I made a spreadsheet. Don't do it.
Cool, thank you.
Yeah.
Very, very, very good talk. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for coming. The few of you who remain, this is great. Thank you so much. I'll be in the Slack, and you know how to find me on the internet. So have a great rest of your day.